It is very hard for archaeologists to explain how that was done using purely leverage and mechanical advantage.
AI just revealed how the ancient Egyptians may have cut granite, and the answer is so strange that it challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient technology. Deep inside the Aswan quarries, researchers have found something that shouldn't be there: smooth, curved, highly consistent cuts carved into one of the hardest stones on Earth. According to the traditional explanation, ancient workers used copper tools, stone hammers, and sheer patience. But the marks left behind tell a very different story. The deeper you look, the stranger it gets. These aren't random scratches or rough impact marks. They are long, flowing arcs, precise, uniform, and repeated across the granite as if the stone had been shaped by a controlled process. And when AI analyzed the geometry of those cuts, the results raised an unsettling question. Were the ancient Egyptians using a technique far more advanced than we ever imagined? Before we uncover exactly what was found in the stone, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what comes next could completely change the way you see ancient Egyptian engineering. The secret isn't written on a papyrus. It's carved directly into the granite. The longer you examine those marks, the harder it becomes to believe they were created by ordinary human labor. For more than a century, the conventional explanation has been straightforward. Ancient Egyptian workers supposedly shaped granite using heavy diorite stones, dense, rounded hammer stones that could withstand repeated impacts. Thousands of laborers would strike the granite again and again, slowly breaking away material through strength, repetition, and incredible patience. It sounds convincing when you read it in a textbook. But then comes the problem. What happens when you actually test that explanation? Researchers have recreated the process under controlled conditions, using diorite tools and skilled workers to strike granite, just as the traditional model suggests. After thousands of impacts, the resulting surfaces were exactly what you would expect from repeated hammering: rough, irregular, uneven, and filled with scattered pits. The depth varied. The curvature changed. The spacing wasn't consistent. The results looked unmistakably human. But the marks at Aswan looked different. They appeared smoother, more consistent, and strangely repetitive, as though the same cutting motion had been reproduced with remarkable precision over and over again. And that difference has been sitting in the archaeological record for decades. It was visible, it was documented, but it didn't fit neatly into the accepted explanation. Then AI entered the picture. Grok AI was given high-resolution photogrammetric scans of the quarry surfaces, capturing the granite down to fractions of a millimeter. Instead of being told what tool to look for, the system was asked a much simpler question. What kind of process could have created these marks? The software compared the geometric signatures against thousands of tool profiles, ranging from ancient implements to modern industrial machinery. It didn't simply look at the cuts, it measured them: arc radius, entry angle, depth, spacing, repetition. Across 847 individual cuts, one number immediately stood out: 4.3%. And that number became the center of the mystery. A human craftsman repeating the same cutting motion will naturally produce variation. Fatigue changes movement, angles drift, depth changes, spacing becomes inconsistent. That's not incompetence, that's simply how the human body works. But the analysis suggested something far more controlled. The measured variation was only 4.3%. The entry angle was similarly consistent, repeating across hundreds of cuts in different locations, orientations, and depths, with a variation of less than 2 degrees. And now the question becomes impossible to ignore. How could a process this consistent have been carried out thousands of years before powered machinery? Grok's closest modern comparisons made the mystery even stranger. Its database returned three major technological analogs: diamond-tipped rotary cutting systems, extremely high-pressure water jet equipment, and ultrasonic cutting tools capable of vibrating blades at frequencies far beyond human perception. None of those technologies existed in ancient Egypt. Yet the closest statistical match was ranked at the top with a reported 94% confidence score. The match? An industrial rotary cutting system using a diamond composite abrasive. In other words, the AI was pointing toward a technology that sounds completely out of place in an ancient Egyptian quarry. A powered rotary cutter capable of working with an abrasive harder than the granite itself. And that's where this story takes another unexpected turn. Archaeologist and space archaeology researcher Dr. Sarah Parcak, whose satellite imaging work has helped transform the way Egyptian archaeological sites are studied, was among the researchers presented with the classification results. She had spent years examining evidence that could challenge conventional assumptions about ancient landscapes and settlements. But this particular result raised a different kind of problem. The issue wasn't simply what created the marks, it was where some of those marks were located. Because as researchers mapped the quarry, they found the same unusual patterns on horizontal surfaces, angled walls, vertical faces, and partially extracted granite blocks. Then they noticed something even more difficult to explain. Some of the cuts appeared in locations where a human worker would have had almost no room to operate. There are narrow interior corners where two granite surfaces meet at extremely sharp angles. In some places, there simply isn't enough space for someone to swing a heavy diorite hammer with any useful force. Other marks appear on vertical surfaces hidden beneath blocks that were never completely removed. If those areas were sealed off during the later stages of excavation, how were the same cutting patterns produced there? And then there are the shafts. Across the quarry complex, geological surveys have identified deep, narrow pits descending roughly 30 to 50 feet below today's surface. Some of them are only 3 to 4 feet wide at the opening. And suddenly, the mystery is no longer just about how the Egyptians cut granite. It's about how they were able to make these cuts in places where the conventional tools and techniques may not have been physically practical. The walls of these shafts are remarkably smooth, and they carry the same strange curved patterns that appear across the exposed quarry surfaces above. Now, imagine trying to create those marks by hand. A worker would have to be lowered into a shaft barely wide enough to move inside. Granite would surround him on every side. There would be no room for a proper swing, almost no leverage, and very little space to reposition a heavy tool. There would also be almost complete darkness. Granite dust would fill the air, trapped inside a confined space with nowhere to escape. And yet, at the bottom of these shafts, the markings appeared geometrically consistent with those found on surfaces where a worker would have had plenty of room to move. That creates a serious mechanical problem. A diorite hammer needs a substantial swing to generate enough momentum to repeatedly strike granite effectively. Estimates put the required swing arc somewhere around 18 to 24 inches. But at the deeper sections of these shafts, there simply isn't enough room for that movement. And this isn't a case of the space being slightly inconvenient. The dimensions make the required motion physically impractical. When Grok analyzed the shaft measurements, it reportedly considered several variables at once: the width and depth of the shafts, the force necessary to create the observed texture in granite, the stone's hardness, and the angle of the cuts compared with the amount of available working space. The result was striking. The system classified the geometry as a spatial impossibility for a conventional percussive hand tool. In simple terms, the physical space doesn't allow the movement that the traditional explanation requires. So what could have created the marks? Whatever process produced them appears to have been capable of operating inside extremely restricted spaces. It could maintain a similar cutting pattern regardless of orientation and apply force directly against the granite without requiring a worker to swing a tool behind it. That doesn't sound like a typical Bronze Age hammer. It sounds much more like a powered cutting system. And stop there for a moment. A powered instrument, operating inside ancient shafts thousands of years before electricity. If you're already wondering whether the traditional explanation can account for this, subscribe to the channel, because the next piece of evidence takes this mystery from the physical scale all the way down to the microscopic level. And that's where things become even harder to explain, because the spatial problem wasn't even the most disturbing result from the analysis. The real surprise appeared when researchers examined the granite under magnification. What the microscope revealed: hammering granite produces a recognizable microscopic pattern. When a hard stone repeatedly strikes granite, the mineral crystals tend to fracture along their natural planes. The result is a surface filled with angular breaks, microscopic cracks, and damage extending beneath the visible cut. At the mineral scale, percussion leaves behind a chaotic signature. It's almost like a microscopic battlefield. But the Aswan surfaces reportedly don't show that pattern. Instead, the microscopic evidence points toward a different kind of material removal. Dr. Tomasz Kowalski, a Polish materials scientist involved in the analysis of cut stone from archaeological sites across the Mediterranean, examined high-magnification samples from Aswan. According to the account, what he observed looked less like shattered material and more like controlled removal. The mineral structures along the surface appeared sheared rather than fractured. Individual grains seemed to separate cleanly at the cutting boundary instead of breaking apart randomly. And perhaps most importantly, the transition between the worked surface and untouched granite appeared unusually sharp. There was no obvious zone of widespread subsurface damage radiating away from the cut. That kind of boundary resembles what you might expect when a precision cutting tool moves through a hard material along a controlled path. But then another detail appeared. At high magnification, researchers reportedly observed tiny spiral patterns across portions of the cut surfaces. These weren't simple scratches. The traces appeared directional, following consistent curves across different sections of the quarry. And the apparent rotational direction remained consistent between multiple examined surfaces. That matters because a repeated spiral trace could indicate that the cutting action itself involved rotation, a fixed rotational direction, a mechanically controlled movement. In other words, the pattern is difficult to explain using a simple handheld percussion tool. Then came another clue: thermal signatures. Certain microscopic areas of the granite showed evidence suggesting localized exposure to elevated temperatures, and the distribution reportedly didn't resemble what you would normally expect from simple stone-on-stone friction. If two rough pieces of granite are repeatedly rubbed together, frictional heating should spread across a relatively broad contact region. But the thermal evidence described at Aswan appeared much more concentrated. Instead of being broadly distributed, the altered areas were localized, almost as though the heat had been generated at specific points during the cutting process. And that raises the most uncomfortable question yet. What kind of ancient tool could remove granite with controlled geometry, produce rotational traces, and generate localized thermal signatures inside spaces where conventional hand tools couldn't physically operate? The thermal evidence becomes even more interesting when you look at how concentrated it appears to be. Instead of the broad heat pattern you would expect from a large stone surface sliding against another, The alteration is concentrated in tiny areas, something much more consistent with a small contact point moving rapidly across the granite, like the tip of a rotary cutting instrument. According to the analysis, the temperatures were also far higher than anything researchers have been able to reproduce using diorite striking granite in experimental tests. But heat wasn't the only unexpected discovery. There was something inside the cuts themselves. Under high magnification, Kowalski's team reportedly detected microscopic traces of corundum embedded along portions of the worked surfaces. Corundum is crystalline aluminum oxide, with a Mohs hardness of around 9. Granite is considerably softer, and that's important because corundum is one of the materials used in modern industrial abrasives. The analysis also reportedly identified structures potentially consistent with diamond-based carbon materials, exactly the kind of extremely hard abrasives used in precision cutting technology today. And now we have a bizarre contradiction. A material associated with advanced industrial cutting appears to have been detected inside stone surfaces that, according to the conventional timeline, were produced thousands of years before modern industrial chemistry. Grok then combined the microscopic evidence into one analysis: the spiral traces, the localized thermal signatures, the sharp boundary between worked and untouched granite, the subsurface characteristics, and the unusual abrasive particles. Taken together, the system reportedly maintained its earlier classification with a confidence level of around 94%. Industrial-style rotary cutting using a diamond composite abrasive, not bronze, not a simple diorite hammer. Diamond-based abrasive technology, inside an ancient Egyptian quarry. According to the story, Park Hack reportedly stood up from her chair when she saw Kowalski's microscopic overlays placed beside Grok's classification results. She had already spent weeks discussing the findings with the research team, trying to determine whether there was another interpretation that could explain the evidence without challenging the established timeline. She had seen discoveries that complicated conventional Egyptian chronology before. But this was different. As she reportedly put it to a colleague, this wasn't merely another complication. It was a problem she didn't know how to close. And then the timeline itself began to move backward. This is the point where everything changes, because the quarry marks aren't necessarily all from the same period. At several locations throughout the Aswan complex, researchers have documented ancient Egyptian red ochre paintings positioned directly over some of these unusual scoop marks. That creates an important chronological clue. If the paintings were applied after the stone had already been worked, then the cuts must be older than the artwork covering them. Radiometric dating and paleographic analysis reportedly place some of those paintings at least 2,000 years before the earliest dynastic Egyptian civilization, with some interpretations suggesting an even earlier date. That would push the underlying cuts into the pre-dynastic period, or potentially even farther back. And that is where the conventional timeline begins to struggle. Because during this period, mainstream archaeology generally describes Egypt as a landscape of smaller tribal and regional communities relying heavily on stone tools, long before the centralized engineering systems associated with the pharaohs had fully emerged. Then came the result that reportedly changed everything. The oldest cuts weren't the roughest, they were the most precise. Grok's temporal analysis compared the geometry of the cuts with their estimated ages across the larger Aswan data set. The reported result showed a 91% confidence that cutting precision was negatively correlated with age. In simpler terms, the older the cut, the more consistent it appeared to be. The newer the cut, the more variation appeared. The later surfaces looked rougher and more irregular. The oldest ones looked cleaner and more controlled. And that creates a very strange historical pattern. because normally technological development moves in the opposite direction. Early tools tend to be crude. Later tools become more sophisticated. Knowledge accumulates, techniques improve, precision increases. Civilizations build upon what came before them. But at Aswan, the reported pattern appears to run in reverse. The later quarry marks, those more clearly associated with established dynastic Egyptian activity, are reportedly rougher and more variable. They look much closer to what conventional Bronze Age tools would be expected to produce. Yet the earlier marks are significantly more consistent. Grok reportedly flagged this reversal as statistically significant, placing it around the 99th percentile. And if that result holds, it wouldn't simply be a matter of selecting a few unusual examples. The same pattern reportedly appears across hundreds of cuts and multiple areas of the quarry complex. The oldest evidence appears to represent the highest level of precision. The later evidence appears less precise. Think about the implication. The marks beneath the ancient paintings may predate the civilization traditionally credited with producing them, and the people who came later may have been producing inferior cuts on the very stone that had already been worked with extraordinary precision. That single possibility creates a problem for the conventional timeline. So, what could explain it? There are essentially two major possibilities. The first is that a civilization existed in the region before dynastic Egypt and possessed a level of stone-working technology far beyond what archaeologists currently attribute to that period. Such a culture could have extracted and shaped granite using a process that doesn't fit neatly into the known ancient tool inventory. Then, somehow, that culture disappeared before the rise of the first pharaohs. Its technology vanished. Its workshops disappeared. Its records were lost. And all that remained were the marks in the stone. The second possibility is even stranger. Perhaps the technology existed during the earliest stages of Egyptian civilization, but was eventually lost, not replaced by something better, not gradually improved, simply lost. Later workers would then have been forced to rely on simpler techniques, producing rougher results on granite that had already been shaped by a more advanced process generations, or perhaps thousands of years earlier. Either explanation creates the same uncomfortable conclusion. Something came before the technology we normally associate with ancient Egypt. Something capable of working the granite. Something precise enough to leave these unusual patterns behind. And whatever it was, its technology did not survive in the historical record. It survived only in the stone. And then, somehow, that knowledge disappeared. Whatever process produced those marks was no longer being used, but the information may still be preserved in the granite itself. And this is where Grok's analysis reportedly uncovered another layer of the mystery, one that may be even more disturbing than the cutting marks. Because granite isn't a perfectly uniform material. Inside every granite block is a complicated internal structure, different mineral bands, variations in hardness, natural weaknesses, and microscopic planes where the crystal structure is more likely to break when pressure is applied. Understanding that hidden architecture isn't easy. Even today, geologists rely on advanced surveying equipment, geological modeling, subsurface imaging, and expert interpretation to determine what lies inside a large granite mass. Yet the ancient cuts at Aswan appear to follow those hidden structures with remarkable precision. The curved grooves don't simply remove stone. They appear to move along natural mineral boundaries, avoid particularly hard inclusions, and take advantage of weaker planes within the granite. In engineering terms, the path would be considered highly efficient, not merely close to optimal, measurably optimal. Modern quarrying companies attempt to achieve similar efficiency using geological models, scanning systems, and subsurface data. Even with those technologies, predicting exactly how a massive block will respond can be difficult. But according to the analysis, some of the ancient Aswan cuts appear to have followed the internal structure of the stone with extraordinary consistency. Grok reportedly tested this possibility by comparing the geometry of the visible cuts with estimated underground mineral structures, using surface mineral composition as an indicator of the internal grain pattern. The reported correlation reached approximately 88% confidence. And that creates a completely different question. Maybe whoever made these cuts wasn't simply skilled at cutting granite. Maybe they understood the granite itself. They may have been able to determine where the stone was strongest, where it was weakest, where particular minerals were concentrated, and where a cut would remove the greatest amount of material with the least resistance. In other words, they knew where the stone wanted to break before they began cutting it. There are two ways to interpret that. The first possibility is that generations of quarry workers developed an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of this particular granite through centuries of experience. That knowledge could have been passed from one generation to the next without ever being written down. And eventually, whoever possessed that knowledge disappeared. The second possibility is far more difficult. Perhaps they had some method of detecting the internal structure of the granite before cutting it, some form of subsurface analysis that has no obvious equivalent in the Bronze Age archaeological record. Either way, the implication is remarkable. The cuts appear to have been planned around structures that couldn't simply be seen from the surface. They were positioned where the stone could be removed most efficiently, again and again, across hundreds of individual cuts. And then the process stopped. No surviving instruction manual, no engineering diagrams, no detailed explanation, no record describing how the quarry workers knew what they were doing. Only the evidence carved into the stone. The granite itself seems to preserve the blueprint. A blueprint that nobody can see directly, and whoever created it is gone. The knowledge disappeared with them. The unfinished obelisk. And then we come to one of the most famous objects at Aswan, the unfinished obelisk. Not far from the quarry floor, this enormous granite monument still sits attached to the bedrock where it was abandoned thousands of years ago. If completed, it would have weighed more than 1,000 tons. Someone began extracting it. Someone had a plan. Someone believed their tools and their technique were capable of completing a project on a scale almost unimaginable for the ancient world. And then, suddenly, the work stopped. The workers never returned. For decades, the conventional explanation has been that a major crack developed in the granite, making the obelisk unusable and forcing the project to be abandoned. But after examining the site again in light of the new analysis, Dr. Mostafa El-Sayed reportedly questioned whether the crack tells the entire story. He had spent years documenting tool marks throughout the Aswan complex. He knew the obelisk site intimately. Yet according to the account, looking at it after the AI analysis made the evidence appear completely different. Because the cutting marks don't simply stop at the fracture, some continue beyond it.